The LCS may be on a 2 week break, but have no fear. Clown Fiesta podcast is still here. Episode 153 coming at you. For the whole 2 week break, it felt like now would be the perfect time to give some predictions on some of the end of split awards that get handed out, those being the All Pro lists, MVP, Most Improved Player, etc., as well as some end of season predictions, those being, who are the two teams that aren't going to make playoffs, if there's a championship favorite, who's going to get knocked out early in playoffs, and most importantly, being who the Spring Split champions are. Now, before I jump into the All Pro list, I just want to preface this by saying, with the standings being as close as they are and the league as competitive as it is, it feels like this is probably the most difficult All Pro list to configure in recent memory. I mean, for the most part, the All Pro lists are typically locked out by the teams who are at the top of the standings. And more typically, the teams that are at the top of the standings are usually so far ahead of the others, it can sometimes be difficult to put some of those players who maybe aren't on some of the best teams on those all pro lists. And why do I preface this? It's because I feel like, a lot of these all pro lists that we do see, whether it's now or towards the end of the regular season, are going to be all over the place. And I think that's just going to be a good thing. I think it's going to make the last 2 weeks of the regular season as exciting as they can be, mostly because we have some teams towards the bottom of the standings that are due to catch up and need to get some wins in order to keep their seasons alive. And yeah, we'll jump into the list here. I'll read it out as I typically do for the audio only people. So on my first team, I have Whippo top lane, River jungle, Jensen mid lane, Bvoy ADC, and Ayla support. Second team being Sniper, Inspired, Dove, Berserker, and Huhi. Third team, Impact, Blabber, Quid, FBI, and Zazel. Now, I want to start with the first team, mostly because it felt like the first team was the easiest. And even though I say it was the easiest, it really wasn't that easy. The only two spots that I had no problem filling in right away were Bwipo and River. Mostly because it feels like those two players are the clear-cut best in their role through 9 games of the split so far. River is having a fantastic season. I think a season that nobody was necessarily expecting because of the players he was playing with. Everybody knows that River is a really good player, but it was more about the doubt of some of the rookies and younger players that 100 Thieves was going to have to rely on for this split. And as I said in the previous episode and the one before, they're just continuing to prove us wrong. And I think River is probably, he's one of the best players in the league, was one of the best players in the league last year. So not that big of a surprise to see him on the number 1 All-Pro list. Bwipo, I thought he was the other clear-cut first-team player who I didn't really have to think about too much. He's just been consistently the best player in the league this split, it feels like. He's always doing very, very well. And even in the 2 FlyQuest losses that we saw, it's bot lane that's been the problem. And I talked about it last week and the week before. If the FlyQuest bot lane was going to be an area of the team that was going to be weak, that was going to be the only reason that FlyQuest was going to struggle. Not because of the top side of the map. We all know how good Bwipo, Inspired, and Jensen are. And Bwipo's just been the most consistent player, in my opinion, the entire split. Wide champion pool, always is doing very, very well. And like I said, even in the losses, he's not the reason for it. Now over to Jensen. For some of the same reasons I had Bwipo as the first team All-Pro top laner, I had that for Jensen. He's just been consistently solid the entire split, whereas I think some of the other mid lane candidates have had very up and down splits. Jojo had a really strong start, but a very poor, last 5 to 6 games. Quid didn't necessarily have the best start, but has had a very, very strong last 4 or 5 games. So it was just kind of all over the place, but Jensen has kind of been the one who's remained at the top, just being consistently good. It's no surprise that he's up here, considering that he's been one of the best mid laners his entire career in the LCS, and the fact that, there was that year where he was on Dignitas, where some people seem to have maybe lost a little bit of faith on him. I feel like that faith, if you were doubting him, that faith should be restored now that FlyQuest has looked so good through the first 9 games and are sitting at the top of the standings. For ADC, I put Bvoy up there. And I don't know if this is a hot take or anything, but to me, it feels like Bvoy is the biggest carry that we have in the LCS right now. I mean, just looking at the Shopify games, even in losses, Bvoy is doing so much work for this team. I really think that the bot lane of Shopify Rebellion, I don't even know if they're being slept on, because I guess the reason why I think they're maybe being slept on is because I haven't heard anybody talk about B-Boy except for myself. This guy, not that I'm comparing him to Berserker, but he's doing what Berserker did when he entered the league. Berserker kind of took the league by storm in becoming one of the best mechanical players in the league, one of the best carries in the league, and a reliable person to do so, even when the team is potentially struggling. And I feel like B-Boy is kind of footing the same bill here. Super strong carry, went ahead, and even when behind, still performs admirably, not necessarily making these game-losing mistakes that we typically see from other AD carries. And I don't know, maybe it's a hot take, but I feel like B-Boy was kind of the clear number one. I don't know. Hopefully, people aren't going to get too mad about that. And last up, I had Ayla for the first team support. Support was probably the hardest role to judge this split, mostly because I think I said this 2 or 3 episodes ago. I just haven't been super impressed with a lot of the bot lanes that we've seen in the LCS so far. I think everybody was expecting the Cloud9 bot lane of Berserker and Vulcan to be very good, as well as the energy bot lane of FBI and Huhi. People thought of Huhi as an upgrade over Ignar. So the fact that they're also struggling a little bit, I think mostly pushed some of the other players up as opposed to, them sort of, dragging themselves down. So I had Ayla as the first team support. He's just done a really good job, being the sort of flex player for 100 Thieves. I think typically we can see support players kind of be suited to one style. Like this could be a guy who's really good at range supports and, an enchanter player and does a really good job of supporting their AD carry in team fights, as opposed to some supports you see a lot on heavy engaged champions like the Alistar, Nautilus, Thresh, whatever those be. And you kind of see those guys as your, engage option with your jungler or your top lane or whatever it may be. I feel like Ayla has just been able to do whatever the team needs, similar to what Huhi has been doing for the majority of his career, where he's comfortable on a lot of specific champions. You can sort of let him, he's got his own creative picks to do what he wants, doesn't necessarily make those big mistakes, is a very solid laner. And yeah, I just think Ayla's done a really good job for 100 Thieves this split as the sort of weak side part of the team. 100 Thieves has mostly been a topside centric team this split, obviously around Sniper and Quid. And one of the biggest strengths of a bot lane is their ability to work on the weak side. More typically we see top laners being the weak side players, but when you need your bot lane to be the weak side tandem, and sometimes that weak side tandem can start running it down and dying a lot, and that can really have a negative effect on the game. And when you are the weak side bot lane and you're not making those mistakes and you're just being neutral and you're helping your team because they're putting their majority of their resources into the other side of the map, I think sometimes that can get lost between fans or spectators, whatever it may be. Like that role is just as important as the people who are doing the carrying on the opposite side. But support was very hard. I definitely will say that. On to the second team. I had Sniper in the top lane. This dude he's just really good. It's as simple as that. I think apart from his first 2 games in the LCS, which was the first week, I think this guy has just been by far and away one of the other best players in the LCS, along with Bwipo and River. I have nothing bad to say about him. The only knocks I can have is the nerves that he potentially had on his first day. The Riven game wasn't necessarily the best, and the Gwen game that he had against Cloud9 wasn't very impactful. But apart from that, this dude has done it all. He actually leads, I believe he leads the league, or he's tied for the lead in solo kills, which is not something that you typically expect from a young rookie, especially when you consider some of the people that he is solo killing. I guess it would have been last week where he solo killed both Impact and I forget who the other person was, but it was another strong top laner. It was C9, yeah, it was Fudge. Yeah, he solo killed both Impact and Fudge, 2 of the best top laners in the LCS for the last 3 years. That's not something we're typically seeing from rookies that enter into the league at such a young age. So the fact that Sniper was able to come into the league, perform really, really well, both within his team and within his own lane, feels like the sky's the limit for him. And like I said, I have nothing bad to say about him. I hope he keeps his mojo going, and he's just a really exciting player to watch going forward. I'd Inspired as the number 2 jungler. Honestly, it's nothing to the fault of Inspired. It's just that River has been so good this split. You kind of couldn't put River number 1, so Inspired sort of ended up being number 2 by default. I still think that this guy is one of the best players in the league. I think that FlyQuest is just a team right now where they haven't. Everyone is contributing. There is no one person that is doing the most of the heavy lifting on this team. Sometimes it's the bot lane, sometimes it's the top lane, sometimes it's the mid lane, and even we've seen Inspired on that one brand game. He can still carry. We know that this guy has all the potential in the world. It's just the fact that maybe the spotlight's been more on 100 Thieves, and part of that is because their expectations weren't as high. But you also can't deny that River has been one of the best junglers in the league. So I still think it could be a toss-up for River and Inspired. I don't think that one is necessarily so far ahead of the other. It's just the jungle pool in North America has been very, very strong the last couple of years, and it continues to be. Maybe a bit of surprise in the mid lane, however, I had Dove. And in addition to support, I thought that mid lane was one of the other more difficult roles to sort of figure it out, mostly because, as I previously said, some of the mid laners have just been very up and down this split. I think a lot of people thought that JoJo was just going to come to Cloud9 and start smashing the league. That necessarily hasn't been the case. It was early on in the split, but over the last 5 games, he hasn't been particularly good. Quid, while I do have him on the third team, he didn't necessarily have the best start to the split, but has had a very strong last 4 to 5 games, which kind of elevated him up there. But you've kind of also have some underperformers on other roles, such as Palafox on NRG, APA still can sometimes be hit or miss. Some of the Insanity hasn't been as good as I thought he was going to be. Even with the wacky picks, and those wacky picks are fun, but it hasn't necessarily translated to Shopify Rebellion wins. So having Dove at number 2, it was tough, but I felt like he deserves it. Similar to kind of what I was talking about with B-Boy, Dove has been a really, really strong carry for Dignitas, both in wins and losses. In Dignitas wins, Dove is usually doing a lot of the heavy lifting, and in a couple of their losses, he's been performing really, really well. I think it was early on in the split, the Team Liquid versus Dignitas game, where Dig had the lead for the majority of the game. I think it wasn't until 33 minutes where Team Liquid sort of mounted a comeback and sort of stole the game from them. But that was a Dove Azir game where he was popping off, I believe, got a quadra kill in it. He's just been really, really solid the whole split. And kind of what I was saying in the preface earlier on is, with the league being so competitive, I do expect there to be some players who aren't necessarily going to be at the top of the standings to make some of these all-pro lists. There's some of these teams have very high highs and very low lows. FlyQuest, their top side of the map has been just in general stronger than their bot side of the map. Maybe, you could say the opposite has been true for a team like Cloud9, where their bot lane and their jungler has been pretty solid, but their solo lanes have really been letting them down. NRG, their top side of the map has been really, really struggling. Dokla and Contracts, but their bot side plus Palafox has still been performing really well. And yeah, I just think that Dove was deserving to be on the second pro team. And if you haven't been watching him, keep an eye on him. He's been really good. Second team AD carry, I have Berserker. I think I once again, I said this in the first team discussion. I just have not been necessarily impressed by a lot of the bot lanes in the LCS this year. And that even includes Berserker himself. I think like everybody thought with the super team that is Cloud9, they were just going to smash the league, and we were going to see the Berserker that we've seen the last 2 years, which is the guy who is winning lane, not missing farm, not dying, and killing everybody. And I just think that Berserker has still been the same player of laning really well, not dying, but he just hasn't had those huge carry moments that we're so accustomed to. There was the Zeri game against 100 Thieves where he almost got 2 pentakills. Well, he got 1 pentakill and almost got the second pentakill, all of them living on 1 HP, but we just haven't seen those flashy moments out of Berserker, and that's ultimately why I had B-Boy above him. Is B-Boy similar to Berserker, strong laner, doesn't die, but he's just been doing the big carrying for Shopify Rebellion, or Berserker just hasn't had that opportunity because I think the solo laners have just been dragging the team down so much. For support, I had Hui. He's another player, I think, similar to Berserker, where the team has just been dragging his performances down, or could be dragging down his just look of how he might be performing this split. I think the NRG bot lane has still been really, really good. The majority of the problems that exist in NRG right now have been the top side of the map with Dokla and Contracts, occasionally Palafox, but I still think that Palafox has been pretty solid. Who he's the best, I've said this before, he's the best, Senna X player in the league, and Senna Tom Kench, or just Senna in general, has been one of the most popular champions in the LCS and around the world these days. always going to be a valuable asset to the team. Super important when it comes to communication and, in-game leading and stuff like that. I don't know, that's not necessarily what we're talking about when it comes to the awards, but I do think that it's something to mention with him and is always going to be positive for him. I guess we'll go on to the third team now. I had Impact in the top lane. Uh, like I said, I think towards the beginning of the split when I was talking about Team Liquid, with this, with this decision to keep Yon and APA and sort of double down on them and instead replace their more carry players, them being Summit and Pioshik, with Impact and Umti, regardless of that, Impact has still been a strong, serviceable top laner. He feels like I'm saying the same thing whenever I talk about Impact. He doesn't lose you the game, doesn't necessarily win you the game, but when the functionality of your team is we're just the primary carries are mid and bot lane, all Impact needs to do is to be good in lane, strong in lane, not necessarily lose, and be impactful in these team fights, and that's what he's continued to do. I have Blabber as a third team jungler. I don't know if that's necessarily going to be a contentious pick or maybe a hot take, but I'll just keep saying it. I don't even care at this point. The solo laners have been the downfall of Cloud9. And Blabber, surprisingly, has actually been put on a lot more frequently. He's being put on the tank utility role this split more than ever. More typically, we see Blabber on these carries, whether it's the Kindred, the Viego, the Olaf. Even as Maokai, while Maokai is primarily viewed as a tank utility champion, Blabber still does a really good job whenever he does pick it. He's still one of the best, farmers in the game. And maybe that, I don't want people to think that's a bad thing when I say farmer, but I just mean your general pathing, what you're doing with your time in the jungle. Well, I will say that he hasn't been as aggressive when it comes to ganks as he has been in previous splits. And I think that is a knock against him, specifically this split, or why I think Rivered and Inspired are the clear number 1, 2 in their role. I would say that just on pure performance this split, there is actually a decent gap between River, Inspired, and Blabber. So I should say River and Inspired, and then Blabber. Whereas typically in the last, I want to say 3 to 4 splits, I guess 4 if you include this one, the trio of Inspired, River, and Blabber have been all neck and neck pretty close. But I would say this is probably the first split in a little while where one of them is significantly below the other two, it being Blabber in this case. So I do think that Cloud9 is going to clean it up, and I do think that should they implement some different strategies, we will see Blabber on more of these carry-oriented champions, and who knows, Blabber, if C9 rises up in the standings, it wouldn't also surprise me to see Blabber kind of jump back up into that 1-2 conversation. Third team mid laner, I had Quid. Hopefully people aren't going to be disappointed that I didn't put Quid number 2, because I think that's most likely what people would be putting at this moment. And I don't want to hate on the guy, but I feel like the recency bias could be kicking in slightly. Quid has obviously had a very, very strong last 4 to 5 games ever since the Super Week, where 100 Thieves has climbed up to second place in the standings. And he's been really good, don't get me wrong. But I just think that the beginning of the split was not good from Quid. Even in some of the wins, I don't think that he was necessarily having the same impact that he is now. But now, these last 5 games is mostly what's pushing Quid up on this list. And that's not to say that he can't continue those performances and get even higher on the list at the end of the split. I think if you're looking at trajectory and Quid's trajectory as a player right now, he's just going to get better and better. So I guess all I have to say is don't necessarily take it as a bad thing that Quid's number 3, because that just means maybe he'll get up to number 2 or even number 1. Who knows? Third team ADC, I have FBI. Feels like FBI is probably the most slept on player in the LCS. Pretty much ever since he got into the league, it feels like nobody wants to give this guy the credit that I think he deserves. And basically what I described to Berserker as this split, being the guy who doesn't make these big mistakes in lane, is always laning very well, constantly up in CS and gold. But he just hasn't necessarily been that big carry. And I think that the carry aspect of FBI is only what's really holding him back from people really recognizing how good of an AD carry he is. And, people can say, well, if he's not doing the carrying, then he's not necessarily doing his job. And it's not necessarily the case when you do have a team that's playing a lot of Senatom Kench and a lot of utility-based bot lanes. They were the ones playing a lot of Jhin Ashe or Jhin whatever. I think they played a Jhin Leona game once, but they played a bunch of Senatom Kench games. And I think sometimes you need to remove the eye candy that could be in front of you, which is the KDA and the CS and the gold differential at the end of the game, and more focus on what they're required to do within those games and what those games look like. When you're playing Senatom Kench, like, you could still be down in gold, but the usefulness of your champions at a certain point is going to be more than your opponents because you're playing those champions. And you can argue that if your goal is to not die, that should be valued just as maybe a little bit less than doing all the carrying yourself. So I just think it'll sort of be a question of how you sort of view those roles and how you judge a player based on that criteria. And I do think that there's a world where people aren't going to have the FBI, the Huhi, the Berserker, the Blabber, the Dove, maybe. Like, they're not going to see that. They're just going to see the results and the end of game results and think one way. But I think you do, at a certain point, you got to strip it back and look at what the players are doing in their role in their team. And then last up, I had Zeyzal. He's just been a very solid partner to Bvoy. And I think, maybe Bvoy's heavy lifting is ultimately why I ended up putting Zeyzal on the list. But like I said, I thought support was one of the most difficult roles to judge, mostly because you look at some of the top teams, FlyQuest, Masu and Busio have been the one weak point of that team throughout the split so far. You go to Team Liquid, Jan and Core JJ, a duo who I was really high on last year, has been underperforming this year. They've been pretty lackluster for Team Liquid. Even the Cloud9 bot lane, despite Berserker being on the list, Vulcan, I think, was another player who, for the most part, people have been underwhelmed by. He's had some sort of goofy mistakes in a couple of the games. He had that one of the Bard games that he had, one of the Renata games that he had earlier on in the split. And I just think that Zeyzal, similar to maybe an Impact, he's just been doing his job really, really well, supporting Bvoy as much as he can, continuing with Bvoy to be a strong laner. And yeah, Zeyzal's back, I think. I think Zeyzal's another player that people weren't necessarily convinced that he was LCS caliber after, he struggled on some other teams that weren't Cloud9 after his days on Cloud9. And I think he's a player who's come back to the LCS, sort of reinvented himself, and he's making a name for himself once again. Well, before I move on from the All-Pro list, I just wanted to give out a few honorable mentions who I thought could be on the list, and maybe he's going to be on some other people's lists. But for jungle, for the third spot, I did consider both XU and Umti. XU, similar to, a player like Zeyzal, whose record and stats might not necessarily reflect, the player performances, but you look at what the guy is actually doing in game, and I think that XU on his team has been one of the most impactful players on the league in terms of what they actually do in the game, how they're playing, what are the responsibilities that they have. And like I said, not last episode, but the one before, XU was basically the guy doing all the heavy lifting for Dignitas when it came to setting up fights and engaging. And after last week, where they had Isles sort of pair up with XU being on one of the engagers, you saw XU being even better because the sole role of engager wasn't on him. Mid laner, I did have Palafox and APA that I did think about. I didn't think about it for too long, but I still think that Palafox has been pretty solid despite the struggles of NRG. Similar with APA, I do think that he can be hit or miss sometimes, but there is no doubt that this guy is getting better, and I think he'll continue to get better in the LCS. And previously it was sort of the opposite, where I was high on Jan and low on APA, but I think this split is, at the way that it's going, it's kind of flipping me to where I have a little bit more confidence in APA than I do Jan. And then last up was Meech in bot lane. He was the only other bot laner I really considered. Ultimately, why I edged out and went with FBI was because of what he's asked to do in the team. Meech is he's just there. You're not really seeing him too much. He's typically, been on a lot of poke Varus. He's had a couple games where he's looked really, really good, but I think there are a lot of games where he just is kind of along for the ride, as opposed to doing a whole lot for the team in that situation. But it's very close. And like I said, I expect a lot of these All-Pro lists to be all over the place. And if you don't agree with my All-Pro lists, then comment below. Let me know. What would you change? I promise I can take it. I don't bite. But with that, speaking of commenting, um, the best thing you can do to help support this podcast is to hit the like button, leave a comment, let us know your appreciation. Don't necessarily know if there's going to be an episode next week. I'm kind of relying on potentially there to be some news, but have no fear. If there's not one next week, there definitely will be the week after, because that's obviously when the LCS will start back up again with week 5. But we're on all major audio platforms as well as YouTube. That would be Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. Whether you listen to it in the car, on your way to work, maybe you're at work, doing work. We appreciate you. Thank you very much. Now, I feel like we should get into the MVP predictions. And maybe if you were listening closely to when I was talking about specific players on the All-Pro list, you might have an early inclination as who my favorites are for MVP this split. We'll start out, I'm just going to sort of do it in I picked out 3 players. I think there are 3 players currently in the running for my books, in my book. I'll start out with who I would have as 3rd place right now. That would be Inspired. Similar to what I was talking about in the All-Pro section, everybody knows that Inspired has the goods and is one of the best players in the league, but he just necessarily hasn't needed to be the carry or to be the all-important, most important person on the team. He's been doing what he's doing. Sometimes he's being the carry, sometimes he's being the tank, sometimes he's being the engage. And all in all, it's just working out really, really well for FlyQuest. The only knock on him, I would say, is just that one game against, was it the game against Shopify, where they were constantly calling for Inspired to come and help protect. I think in some instances, you just need to accept that your bot lane's going to get shit on and they're going to lose, and then you just need to shift your focus to the opposite side of the map, because that was the same game that they picked the Darius top lane for Whippo. And when you're picking Darius, if you're not helping that lane to get a lead, you're probably not doing something right. So if I were to knock Inspired, that would really be the only thing that I would knock him for, is just that one game against, I believe it was Shopify. No, maybe it was the game against NRG. Might have been the game against NRG. If I have those two mixed up, I'm sorry. But yeah, the only thing to knock him would be that decision to constantly cover bot lane, as opposed to taking the loss on that side of the map and trying to gain a lead on the opposite side of the map, most specifically when you have a champion like Darius. Second, I have Bvoy. Now, despite Shopify's 3-6 record, and honestly, it would be pretty wild for a team with a 33% win percentage to have the MVP on their roster, this guy is just a mega carry. I don't know what to tell you. This guy is one of the biggest beasts in the league that we have right now. Strong laner, great team fighter, doesn't make these big mistakes. He's got the... I don't even know what the right word for this is, but he's got the balls to be walking up in your face when he what's the best way to even say this? You do see those players, like Stixxay, I think, is a really good example, where he has a very strong understanding of when he can walk up and when he needs to back up. And I think one of the most important things about AD carry is knowing how to toe that line of stepping up into their face so you can hit them, but also being far enough back to not get hit by their engage and respecting their cooldowns and whatever the tools that the opponent team might have. And Bvoy, I think, does a really good job at that. Even when Shopify is in some of these losing situations, he's trying to toe that line as much as he possibly can to get his team back into the game. And when he is ahead and when they are winning the game, he is the guy that is winning them the game. He's had a ton of really strong Xayah games. He's been one of the more on-hit Varus enjoyers as opposed to the poke lethality Varus. Yeah, just a really, really strong player. Really exciting that he's in the LCS, honestly. I didn't really hear a whole lot about him coming into the split. I knew that he had previously played a little bit in the LEC, and he's floated around that sort of EMEA Masters scene, some other smaller, minor regions, but good that he's here now. Hopefully he can be a building block for Shopify moving forward. No surprise that in first place, I have River. He would be my MVP favorite if the season ended today. He's continued his really strong performances from last year in Golden Guardians. People thought he got robbed of MVP last summer, where Blabber won it. And I don't necessarily disagree with that statement. I ultimately still believe that Blabber was the MVP, but you could easily make the case for River being the number 2 guy. And if he would have ended up winning MVP, I wouldn't have been mad at it. And maybe he's just on his revenge tour right now. And I think the reason mostly why he's getting propped up so much is the expectations weren't for him to be the MVP. It wasn't for 100 Thieves to be the second place team in the league. It wasn't for them to be 6-3. I think the majority of people thought that this was going to be a bottom team in spring, maybe had some potential to improve in summer because of the youth on their team and the inexperienced players. But the fact that River has taken this team to second place, looking like one of the best junglers in the league, scratch that, the best jungler in the league, makes him the clear-cut MVP favorite in my eyes. I think B-Boy and Inspired, they have a case. They still need to do what they've been doing in the second half, or I guess the last third of the regular season, but River, I wouldn't say he has it locked up because obviously anything can happen in the last few games here, but he's got a bit of a lead going into the last remainder of the split. Next up, I have most improved player. Now, I don't necessarily know that they do the most improved player every split. They only debuted it last year, specifically in summer. They didn't do it in spring, so I don't necessarily know if it's a year-round one as opposed to a split one, but let's just assume that they're doing it every split. And as of right now, I think no surprise here, I'd put Quid. And, I think there was a couple other players that you can make the case for. Number 2 being Ayla. And honestly, maybe even should be Ayla, considering that I had put him as, number 1 All-Pro. But I think that was a little bit more of a byproduct of the supports being of lesser importance, maybe, right now. But Quid is definitely the player that I have, at the forefront. Has looked really, really good over the course of the last 5 games. Didn't necessarily have the best start, as I said, but you look at his trajectory, he's just going to continue to get better and better. And he's looking like a really strong carry for 100 Thieves. Now, one thing that I will say about this award is last year, at the end of the summer split, they gave it to Licorice. And if you remember or were listening to the podcast back then, I didn't necessarily agree with the logic that a player who at one point was the best player in their role and one of the best players on their respective teams, talking about Licorice on the Cloud9 days, the fact that he then went to other teams, struggled, was considered maybe one of the worst players in his role at a certain point, but then got back to that high level, I didn't necessarily agree that that player improved and was eligible to win most improved player. That there's something with that logic that doesn't necessarily, sit with me, right? But if you were to use that logic, I think that Tactical also might be another player that you could throw into the conversation. I've been really critical of Tactical over the course of the last 2 years, basically ever since, I guess it would have been Season 11 playoffs, where the Tactical Malphite ult memes started, where he was constantly jumping forward on Tristana into the middle of multiple people. That's kind of where I think the downfall of Tactical started. He then made his way to TSM, then to Immortals last year, and continued to stay on Immortals this year, which I think a lot of people were very surprised about. But I think that he's had a decent split so far. Immortals obviously hasn't been one of the best teams, similar to both Shopify and Dignitas, but he's had some pretty good performances in both wins and losses. And if you were to use that logic of just looking at a player's improvement based on last year as opposed to maybe their entire career, I think you could throw him into that conversation. Next up would be Rookie of the Split. Now, it's normally Rookie of the Year, but guess what? I wanted to give some specific recognition for this split, mostly because they got to give it to Sniper. Even if it's next year, I feel like you already got to give it to Sniper. This kid's come in, been one of the best tops in the league. I think he's tied for most solo kills in the league. Stomping on some of the best tops in the LCS. Not even just right now, some of the best all-time top players in the LCS. And looks really, really good. I think he's got a bright future in the league. Hopefully, come to think of it, 100 Thieves, they need to get back to their former glory should they want to keep this guy potentially moving forward. I feel like if 100 Thieves doesn't necessarily continue to be one of the one of the top tier teams in the league, it might be a bit of a situation where could look to go elsewhere because he is that good of a player. Kind of like a JoJo EG type of thing. Last up, I have coaching staff of the split. I felt like this was the most obvious one, similar to the whole rookie, of the split. I kind of just made that one up because it's typically Rookie of the Year, but I left those two to the end because it feels like they're the most obvious. Coaching staff being 100 Thieves and Golden Glue. Golden Glue, the head coach, Jungle Juice, the general manager. Like I said, it's all about the expectations. Most people didn't think that 100 Thieves would be this good to begin with. The fact that they're 6-3, the fact that all their players are performing really well, and they had 4 people on my All-Pro list. I think it's pretty obvious who coaching staff of the split would be. Now to get into some end of season predictions. I just felt like, with the 2-week break, obviously a good time to talk about the playoff picture, who is potentially not going to make playoffs, who is going to make playoffs, and I guess I'll start out by saying who I think the 2 teams are that are going to miss playoffs. And while it is sad to say, I'm unfortunately going to have to say both Immortals and Dignitas. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm still rooting for Immortals to make playoffs. I think that they can do it, but they're ultimately going to be gatekept by the fact that they're tied in the bottom of the standings right now. And in the week 4 of LCS, so not this past weekend, but the one before, Immortals played Dignitas in a very pivotal matchup, which Dignitas ended up winning, and Dig has a 2-0 head-to-head against Immortals already. That does not help them at all whatsoever when it comes to making playoffs, because Dignitas is going to be a team that they're going to be fighting for to get into the playoffs. So if your predictions were to be that Shopify is not going to be one of those teams to rise and will ultimately finish towards the bottom, you're not going to get a tiebreaker between Immortals and Dignitas because Dig has that 2-0 head-to-head over them. And when it comes to Dignitas, I think that as opposed to their head-to-head records against other teams, it's more about the games that they have yet to play. As we're only playing 14 games in the regular season this split, the fact that we have 5 games left and 4 of those 5 games are all against, I'm talking about Dignitas here, 4 of those 5 games are all against teams that are above them in the standings. Shopify Rebellion is the only team that Dig has yet to play still in the second half of the round robin that isn't above them in the standings. And the fact that they've played Immortals and NRG, whom they're tied with NRG and above Immortals, you still have to play FlyQuest, TL, 100 Thieves, and C9. That doesn't necessarily help them going into the playoffs. And partially the remaining schedule is why I have a team like Shopify making it, despite them being tied for last place and 1 game back from the likes of NRG, C9, and Dig, who are tied at 4 and 5. It's because they already played in the second half of the round robin, both FlyQuest and Team Liquid. FlyQuest being obviously the number 1 team, Team Liquid being the number 3 team. So the fact that they got 2 of their more difficult matches out of the way early on in the second half of the round robin, I think sort of plays into their hand for making playoffs. And hopefully that, maybe it gives them the extra boost that they need after this 2-week break, because they know they have these very winnable games in front of them. It's just all about going out there and executing and building on what they've been doing over the course of the last 2 weeks since B-Boy has come in. And hopefully we get some more traditional mid lane picks out of Insanity, because I will say I do like Insanity on more of your typical mid lane style of champions. While his Orianna wasn't necessarily the greatest of all time, he doesn't necessarily pop off on that champion. It just, I think, suits the team a lot better. Now, next up, I wanted to talk about one team who I think could potentially make an early playoff exit, whom, people view as, maybe a bit of a contender. And I don't want to kick them when they're down, because I was already kind of down on them both last week and a little bit this week. Team Liquid. I've been struggling with trying to find reasons to believe in this team when it comes to winning an LCS championship. And I think, unfortunately, they just have a ton of bad matchups against other teams in the rest of the league. You got teams like FlyQuest, whose strengths are their top side of the map, and, their strengths are the top side of the map, with bot lane not necessarily being the strength of that team. And you look at Team Liquid, I was expecting going into the split for them to be a very heavy bot-centric team, and for Jan and Corjay to be some of the best performing players on the team, and just really hasn't been the case. So unless Team Liquid's bot lane can really step it up and punish the FlyQuest bot lane, I think it'll be very difficult for them to win a series against them should they face them, potentially in the second round, assuming that FlyQuest were to get a bye. Now, you look at teams like 100 Thieves and Cloud9, teams that they could end up facing in the first round should 100 Thieves maybe not finish as the second seeded team. Those are first round matchups that you would hate to see. Those are teams that you not want to see in the first round, both 100 Thieves and Cloud9. Despite the struggles from Cloud9, I think there is a pretty common perception that they're going to improve in the second half of the split. They potentially got to figure some things out when it comes to, finding some of their players getting defined roles on the team and maybe scaling back some of the experimentation that they're doing. And 100 Thieves, I mean, similar to how I talk about the lack it feels wrong to say lackluster top side of Team Liquid because they're not lackluster. It's just not their role to be the superstars of Impact and Umti. You look at the side of 100 Thieves, and the superstars are Sniper and River. You can throw Quid in there if you you include the mid laner does everything, basically, is what I'm saying. You throw Quid in there, and Quid's been better than APA. River's been the best jungler in the split. Sniper is one of the best tops in the league. I think Team Liquid, unfortunately, just has a lot of bad matchups, and I feel like they're going to be reliant on having a very strong second half or end of the regular season to ensure that they maybe get one of those first round buys if they finish, either first place or second place. I think that's going to be really important for Team Liquid because I could see a first round exit, or I guess I should say drop to the lower bracket for Team Liquid if they don't finish in one of the top two spots. Now, last up, we got the winners of Spring Split. And I feel like I'm going to catch some flame and some hate for this, but I'm still going to pick Cloud9. And I apologize in advance if I'm pissing off a lot of people when I say Cloud9. And if you want to say that I'm biased against Cloud9, you can say that. I will admit I am a Cloud9 fan, but I do try to be as unbiased as possible when talking about these things. It's just hard for me to see Cloud9 going on this colossal collapse, after the 2-week break, like in a world where Cloud9 doesn't fit, like, I what am I trying to say here? I just can't see a world where Cloud9 learns nothing from this 2-week break, has a mediocre last 5 games, and loses, in the playoffs. I think that ultimately the strength of this team is going to be in the best of 5 stage, and especially with this shortened spring season, I think feels a bit risky to say this, but you can't necessarily put a ton of stock into the regular season. I know that that's probably not something that people want to hear, and maybe some might say that's an excuse, or you can't really say that because the regular season is what we base our playoff predictions on. But at a certain point, with the whole live patch, especially like with the 2-week break, we're starting on a fresh new patch. I believe we're going to be on 14.4. And then I think we're going to be on 14.5 in the last week of the regular season. And I'm hoping that Cloud9 can really take this opportunity to figure out the dynamic of the team. Because like I said in last week's episode, the problem with Cloud9 is not the players on the team. It's not what they're doing. It's the fact that they're pigeonholing themselves into these specific comps that they pick, and the champions that they pick, most specifically for their solo laners that have the requirement that we need to get ahead, we need to play well, we need to execute, we need to play these very hard to execute comps, and they haven't done that as of late. And I expect and predict Cloud9 to scale it back a little bit in the back half of the regular season and maybe the start of playoffs. Get Jojo and Fudge on some more simplistic things that don't require you to be a mechanical god in order to perform. While Akali is a very strong champion in the meta, you can't necessarily, Jojo, he's not Faker, he's not Chovy, like he's not one of these guys who's mechanically perfect all the time. And I think that get this guy back on some of the control mage stuff, the Azir, the Orianna, they're going to be fine. Similar to Fudge, get this guy back on the Udyr, get him on the Cassante. I'm done with, I don't want to see him on the Aatrox, don't want to see him on the Olaf. Can't say, I think he had one Rumble game, but that was earlier in the split where Cloud9 was doing a lot of winning. Get him back on those kind of champions. And it might be boring, but I still feel like Cloud9 is still going to win the split. I have FlyQuest as the runner-up. I say that because it's important to know who's going to qualify for MSI. So I would have FlyQuest number 2. Like I said, not necessarily the biggest fans of Team Liquid and their outlook for playoffs and best of 5, and it's pretty difficult to look at the 100 Thieves team and have a lot of confidence going into playoffs where none of these players, except for River, basically, none of these players have really played in any best of 5s. I think Ayla might have played in one series in last summer's playoffs before they got bounced in the first round, and maybe they won either 1 or 2 series. The point being, none of these guys have had a lot of playoff experience, the only one being River. And I think ultimately that will be the biggest detriment of this team come the end of spring split. I think that, like I said, the split's already a win for them. They're just going to get better and better. And, if they do keep getting better and they can finish top two, then I don't even know what to say. They're going to be like the Cinderella story of the LCS. But I don't expect them to necessarily be the strongest team come playoff time. And I would expect the top two teams to be seen on FlyQuest, but I still have Cloud9 edging out as the split winners. We got some quick news to close out the show. Obviously, the LEC winter split just concluded yesterday. Yesterday being Sunday, with G2 versus Mad Lions. Mad Lions Koi, I should say, in the final. G2 winning 3-1. Mad Lions Koi, honestly surprising a lot of people throughout the split. I didn't watch as much LEC as I'd previously been doing, so don't really have a lot to comment on the series. I didn't actually watch the whole series. I just watched the highlights of it because I was really busy this weekend. I was hoping to watch all of the LEC this weekend and maybe do a little LEC special, but I literally wasn't able to watch the first two series, and I only was able to catch the highlights from the finals with G2 winning. But the only reason why I bring up the LEC, the big news of the weekend was Adam got benched before the finals weekend due to toxicity. There was a lot of drama going on League Twitter and on the Reddit, where BDS came out with a statement, or sorry, I should say, start over. BDS came out with a statement that they were benching Adam and promoting Gen X to the team to start the finals weekend, and a lot of people were super confused by this. And a couple of days had passed, and people were wondering if we were ever going to get the answers as to why this happened. Now, with Adam's past, people were kind of speculating that it probably is due to toxicity or some potential issues that have been going on internally into the team. But then an article on Sheep Esports broke where they talked about there being a specific incident between him and the coaching staff that had happened, which had led to the benching. And then Adam came out with a statement, which kind of forced their head coach Striker to come out with a statement. And unfortunately, I feel like this is kind of the straw that broke the camel's back when it comes to Adam and his career and his toxicity. The prime A example is Dardoch in the LCS. Dardoch came onto the scene, was a really strong player, was a strong performer on Team Liquid when people didn't necessarily think that he was going to take over the league, but ended up, in Season 6 was one of the better junglers in the LCS, and the fact that his toxicity sort of caught up with him towards the end of Season 6 with the whole breaking point thing. He then was able to, he got his second chance. He went to Immortals in that spring split. Then they made that whole Immortals and CLG made that whole trade for Dardoch and Xmithy because CLG really believed in Dardoch and thought he did a really good job. And he ended up ultimately getting benched on CLG for the same reasons, where Omar God came in. And you pretty much saw from there it became really, really difficult for Dardoch to find a spot in the LCS. Yeah, he did. He made his way on some smaller teams for some smaller stints. After the whole CLG thing, he went to Optic Academy, played a couple of games for Optic in the LCS, then went to TSM, only lasted half a split there, went to Dignitas, lasted like 3/4 of a year there, ended up getting benched, and the whole Acadian thing was happening then, and he's pretty much out of the league now. At one point tried to role swap to support, but I fear that this is going to be the same sort of situation for Adam, where we knew all the drama that happened on Fnatic during their Worlds run a couple of years ago. He sort of then got his second chance on BDS. BDS has now since become a very strong team and one of the better teams in the LEC because of Adam. But then this situation happens again where he's forced to get benched. Basically they said in the statements they had to control. The only way that they felt that they could control Adam and his toxicity was to bench him. It seemed that they were probably still of the opinion that Adam was going to give them the best chance to win, but they felt that if they did that, it sort of wouldn't be the best way to go about the situation in terms of the health of the overall team. So I think, unfortunately, this is probably going to lead to Adam with either limited opportunities in the LEC or, his removal from BDS. And, you have that asterisk on yourself because of toxicity. It's a pretty common thing in League of Legends where you don't pick up and you don't play toxic players because it's only going to hurt your team environment. And fortunately, I think Adam's now sort of fitting that bill. Next up, we have Tyrmbi. He's back in the LEC. Apparently, he's going to replace Kaiser on Team Heretics for the spring split. Another kind of got a bit of a backlash because the Kaiser posted this XD on Twitter and then only a couple hours later, the report came out that Tyrmbi was replacing him. And like I said, I didn't watch a whole lot of LEC, so I can't really comment on how Kaiser was performing. But from what I heard from guys like I Will Dominate and the rest of that sort of, scene, co-streaming, live streaming scene in the LEC, Kaiser wasn't the problem. The majority of the problems on Team Heretics were the solo laners of Wonder and Perk. So the fact that he's maybe the only one who's getting replaced kind of had people a bit angry. But despite Kaiser having decent performances and getting benched, I feel like everyone can still safely say that Tyrmbi will be an upgrade to that. And who knows, maybe that's what players like Wonder and Perks need, is another veteran leader, veteran shot caller, one of the best supports in the league that can really help out. And then last up, Crimson, who is the twin brother of Sniper and the younger brother of Viper, apparently hit rank 1. And why do I even mention this? Well, Viper debuted in the LCS in 2019. Sniper debuted in the LCS in 2024. So I think we can already pen Crimson in for a starting spot in LCS 2029. Bit of a joke there, but I don't know. These guys have how professional athletes, like in the NBA, NFL, NHL, MLB, they'll have like a family of athletes where all of them get into the league and they're all pretty good. Feels like we kind of have a similar situation going on here with the Sniper, Viper, Crimson family, where they're all just gods at League of Legends, and most likely he's going to find his way into the LCS at some point. Maybe it won't be 2029, but if we're to use the same trajectory, at the very latest it'll be 2029. Who knows? He could get in earlier, but potential LCS player to look out for in the near future, next couple of years. That'll be it, though. A shorter episode, mostly because there was no games going on, and we had the 2-week break. Like I said earlier, not exactly sure if there'll be an episode next week. I think a lot of it'll hinge on sort of some news coming out potentially, and maybe I think of something interesting to talk about. But I guess if I had to guess right now, probably not. But who knows? Maybe you'll catch another one of these shorter episodes where I just talk about some things that I want to talk about. This has been episode 123 of the Clown Fiesta podcast. Catch you later.